death, tragedy, and professional wrestling. These are three words that are often brought up when describing the Von Erich family. They're regarded as an iconic legacy family of pro wrestling who collectively contributed so much to its history and promotion during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. However, what should have been a happy family story ended up being one filled with tragic accidents and horrific deaths. Behind the cowboy hats and latex tights stood a Texas family that experienced so much. And today, we're gonna meet them. These are the real Von Erichs. Hi, welcome back everyone. I know it's been a while since I last uploaded, but that's okay. As you probably gathered from the intro, we have a pretty tough topic to cover today. Anyone who's been a fan of professional wrestling has likely heard of the Von Erich family. They're a family of pro wrestlers active mostly in Texas from the 1950s to the 1990s, and even to this very day. You may also recognize the name from Sean Durkin's 2023 film, The Iron Claw, with Zac Efron and Jeremy Allen White, which is a film based on the story that I'm going to tell today. The main 6 members of the family we're going to be covering today are Fritz Von Erich, the father and head of the family, and his 5 wrestler sons, Kevin, David, Kerry, Mike, and Chris. Each of them have fascinating and ultimately devastating stories that easily could be videos on their own. So here we're going to talk about each of them, but I just want to give you 2 warnings beforehand. First of all, the timeline is going to be a bit messy. We're going to jump around a lot from year to year, but at the end of the video, after we've gotten the story out of the way, we're going to review a brief chronological timeline of their family events, which is also in the video description. Secondly, and most importantly, be forewarned that in this video we do talk a lot about mental health and self-deletion. I don't know if that's the right term to use, but I think you get the idea. YouTube, please don't delete my channel. Please. Thanks. So, without further ado, there's no better place to start than at the very beginning, with the head of the family, Fritz Von Erich. Fritz Von Erich, whose real name was Jack Atkinson Sr., and who was formerly a college football star, began training with legendary wrestling trainer Stu Hart in the early 1950s. He made his debut with Klondike Wrestling in 1953. His original gimmick, and this is how you know we're talking about a different time, was as one half of a pair of pseudo-Nazis with his kayfabe brother Waldo Von Erich. Oh, and for those unfamiliar with the term, kayfabe is the portrayal of staged events within the industry as real or true. So, kind of like global politics, I guess. Anyway, Fritz and Waldo Von Erich were multi-time tag team champions before Fritz ultimately stopped traveling to the Northeast. This is after the first of many family tragedies, the death of his first son. Jack Atkinson Jr. was born on September 21st, 1952, and tragically lived a very short life. Jack died in 1959 by drowning in a puddle after being electrocuted at home. He was only 6 years old. While the death of his son deeply affected Fritz and stopped him from traveling to the East Coast, he didn't entirely cease his travels as he continued wrestling in Texas. In fact, he earned a little bit of a reputation for taking out his real aggression in the ring, which led to some wrestlers downright refusing to work with him. Jack Jr.'s death, along with the later tragedies that the Von Erichs would face, gave rise to a rumor that the family name Von Erich was cursed. Some even speculated that the ghost of a Holocaust victim was haunting the family because of Fritz's Nazi persona. So Fritz went on to become a multi-time world champion and earned several other championships throughout the National Wrestling Alliance, or NWA. However, nothing was more memorable than his infamous signature move, the Iron Claw.
Iron Claw applies it as only he can. It is rather like taking a grape and squeezing it until the seed pops out.
You know, Bill, I've seen Fritz.
This move involved Fritz literally wrapping his hand around his opponent's temple and just squeezing. It was apparently pretty effective. And by this point, Fritz wasn't a Nazi anymore, which is probably a good thing, yeah. In 1969, Fritz came to own both the World Class Championship Wrestling Promotion, or WCCW, a territory of the NWA, and the Dallas Sportatorium, a world-famous arena in Dallas, Texas, where WCCW was based and aired weekly on national television. This became his primary business until he sold WCCW years later. One unfortunately notable aspect of Fritz's career is that he never won the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship. For one reason or another, the most prestigious title in all of pro wrestling at the time kept slipping through his fingers every time he got close to it. Fritz and his wife Doris had 5 other children: Kevin, David, Kerry, Mike, and finally, Chris. As you could probably imagine, watching your dad dominate other wrestlers in a ring with thousands of other people watching would inspire anyone, as it did the kids. So, at various ages, each of the 5 kids began their wrestling training and started their careers. It started with Kevin, David, and Kerry Von Erich, who each had great singles careers and were similarly successful as a tag team in their father's company, WCCW. But before we continue, let's take a closer look at each of the first 3 Von Erich kids to get a sense of where they were at. First up is Kevin Von Erich. Like his father, Kevin was a football star and aspired to play in the NFL. Unfortunately, an injury ended those dreams, so again, like his father, he turned to professional wrestling. He debuted in WCCW in 1976 and very quickly found success. His athletic ability and strong physique made him a top contender in the company, and while it wasn't the only factor, it certainly didn't hurt that his father owned WCCW. Kevin was also famous for wrestling barefoot. Okay, that's something. That's something. What the was that? What on earth was that? So just a little explanation on that. I was recording my video when I heard this huge boom sound that I could have sworn was an actual explosion. Of course it wasn't. It was actually just a sonic boom from a SpaceX rocket launch that happened at the Kennedy Space Center, which is just like 30 miles away from me. I probably should have known that it was a rocket launch, but I honestly didn't expect there to be an actual sonic boom, which is why my first thought was that, oh shoot, there's an explosion. Something exploded. I started to overreact there a little bit. Or maybe I reacted normally. I don't really know. It's up for you to decide. Kevin was also famous for wrestling barefoot, which the announcers would joke about by calling him the Barefoot Boy. He had various feuds, but one in particular solidified him as a singles competitor, that being his feud with Bruiser Brody, who he eventually defeated for the NWA American Heavyweight Championship. Another significant feud of his was with multi-time NWA World Champion Ric Flair, who he faced on several occasions.
Amateur in Denton County.
On some occasions, Kevin actually came close to defeating Ric Flair for the title, but ultimately it never happened. In 1980, Kevin married Pamela May, who he's actually still married to today. Besides a list of other championships that we'll talk about later, he went on to have 4 children of his own. This becomes important later, but for now, let's just move on. David Von Erich, also a former college football star, had similar successes. He debuted in 1977 and soon became one half of the NWA Texas Tag Team Champions and later the NWA American Tag Team Champions alongside his brother Kevin. David was on an even more impressive trajectory than his brothers at the time. He was just as talented in the ring as his brothers, and equally as physically imposing at 6'6" and 230 pounds, but he was uniquely skilled on the microphone, which allowed him to engage the crowd more effectively than his brothers.
And you know, I haven't used these spurs. I want y'all to get a good close-up of this right here. These are a brand new pair of spurs here.
Oh, they're heavy.
Tim Brooks. The ones I used to have, I wore them out. But you know, I broke a lot of quarter horses, but I've never broke a jackass before. And this is gonna be my first time with Tim Brooks. And Arman Hussein, if you come out there a little bit later, I'm gonna break you too.
He was so popular that he was able to face the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion Harley Race not once, but twice within his first 2 years. His first match with Race was a 2 out of 3 falls match for the NWA World title that ended in a 30-minute time limit draw. The second was a non-title match that David won actually by applying the Iron Claw to Harley Race. David married Candy McLeod in 1978, and they had a daughter together named Natasha, who tragically did not live past 13 weeks. She died of sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, which is just such a crazy but fitting name for that, but I digress. David and Candy separated shortly after their daughter's death and were divorced not long after. He did, however, remarry in 1982 to Patricia Matter. They remained married until David's death. David went on to win several other singles and tag team championships during his career, which ultimately ended in 1984 along with his life. But hang on, because we'll talk about that in a bit. Finally, there's Kerry Von Erich, who, and you won't believe this, was also a college football star, held a record-breaking discus throw in high school, and was a contender for the 1980 Summer Olympics. He debuted in 1978 alongside his two brothers. As you can imagine from Kerry's introduction, he was very athletically gifted, and that really showed in the ring. However, for the first few years of his career, he had short angles with various of the wrestlers and got as far as winning the NWA American Heavyweight Championship, but that was about as far as it went, until he started teaming with his brothers, which elevated him even higher. He eventually got the chance to wrestle the NWA World Champion Harley Race, just like his brother David did. Fortunately for Kerry, he won in a non-title match. While he didn't take the NWA World title home, he did establish himself as a main eventer like his brothers. From 1981 through 1983, Kerry feuded with NWA World Champion Ric Flair, just like his brother Kevin. The two had some intense battles, but they only had 2 World Championship matches before 1983, both of which Ric Flair won to retain the title. However, the second of those matches, a steel cage match, ended rather controversially when Michael Hayes, the special guest referee, and Terry Gordy, 2/3 of the faction the Fabulous Freebirds, interfered and cost Kerry the match.
Hit in the head by that cage door as Gordy threw it too, and Kerry Von Erich smashed by the cage door, leaning over the rope.
This was more than just a match, more than just a world championship match. It was the beginning of a heated, yet extremely iconic rivalry between the Von Erich brothers and the Fabulous Freebirds. And I mean heated. Okay, this rivalry between these two groups went on for years. Kevin, David, and Kerry, the Von Erichs, feuded with the Fabulous Freebirds, consisting of Michael Hayes, Terry Gordy, and Buddy Roberts, over various trios championships, including the NWA 6-man Tag Team Championship, for the better part of the next 2 years. The fans hated the Freebirds, making them the heels of the storyline, and loved the Von Erichs, making them the babyfaces. Remember how I mentioned that David Von Erich was especially over with the crowd? Well, he was being groomed to become the next NWA World Champion and begin a feud with Ric Flair. Things were looking up for the Von Erich family. However, this feud ultimately did lead to the next major tragedy that family would face: the death of David Von Erich. David's main event feud took him on a global tour, establishing himself as a true and deserving World Championship contender. As a part of this, he toured with All Japan Pro Wrestling, where he defended the NWA United National Championship while building towards a World Championship match against Ric Flair. However, that match never happened. David had been feeling ill for a while, but never sought medical attention because he was afraid of losing his shot at the world title. The film The Iron Claw depicts this at Kevin's wedding, where David is found vomiting blood after the service. However, this portrayal isn't entirely accurate. While David definitely did feel sick, his symptoms didn't start until shortly before his Japanese tour. According to his father, Fritz, David thought it was just a stomach bug or something, just the flu for that matter. So he went on tour anyway. And on February 10th, 1984, David was found dead in his Tokyo hotel room. He was 25 years old. David's death and the lore surrounding it could easily be its own video. Several stories and allegations have circulated about how exactly David Von Erich died and who was responsible. Initially, the remaining Von Erich family members were notified that David had died of a heart attack. However, theories of drug abuse, specifically hydrocodone, spread worldwide. Even Ric Flair later alleged that Bruiser Brody, a close friend of David, had a direct hand in his death and cleaned up any evidence of drug abuse before David's body was found. However, the cause of death documented by the U.S. Embassy in Japan is listed as ruptured intestines resulting from acute enteritis. While I'm not a doctor or a medical professional by any means, my amateur, very low understanding is that opioids and painkillers like hydrocodone, when abused, can cause gastrointestinal damage of some kind. Again, I don't know. So there's that. Please don't murder me if I got that wrong. Obviously, this tragedy hit the family very hard. There was now this hole in the family that couldn't easily be filled, if at all. And not only was there a hole within the family, but there was also a hole in the professional wrestling world. On the family side of things, the fourth Von Erich child, Mike, started wrestling in 1983 and tried to be everything his brother was, but to little avail. Mike was generally smaller, less talented, and less charismatic on the microphone than his brother David. And that's not to say that Mike wasn't a good wrestler. He was. It's just he wasn't his brother when he needed to be. With that said, it was now up to Kerry or Kevin to take David's spot in the World Championship match against Ric Flair. On May 6th, 1984, nearly 3 months after David's death, 45,000 people attended the David Von Erich Memorial Parade of Champions at Texas Stadium. That night, Kerry Von Erich went one-on-one with Ric Flair for the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship and won. Finally, after everything that the family had gone through, the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship, a title that their father Fritz couldn't even achieve, was finally under the banner of WCCW in the Von Erich name. This was big news to everyone who supported the family, and especially for the family themselves. However, life happens, and only 18 days after winning the title, it was taken back by Ric Flair in Yokosuka, Japan. The match ended pretty controversially as Kerry's feet were on the bottom rope during the pinfall, which should have broken the count and continued the match. Unfortunately, the referee ignored his feet and continued to count to 3, crowning a new champion, Ric Flair. This decision was apparently made because Kerry had no-showed some events, and it was decided that he wasn't the right man to be the NWA World Champion. He ended up having the 12th shortest NWA World title reign in history as of right now. But let's take things back to Mike. Mike, as I previously mentioned, was trying his best to fill the void created by David's death. Overall, he did fine. You can't blame the guy for not being a world champion level contender when his original interest was in music, and all he wanted to do in WCCW was work the cameras. But family means everything, right? So Mike put his feelings aside and made his professional wrestling debut. Of course, his debut was before David's death, so afterward it became a much heavier burden on Mike. During his unfortunately short career, he earned 2 singles titles, the NWA American Heavyweight Championship and the WCCW Middle Eastern Championship, and won the NWA World 6-Man Tag Team Championships with his brothers 4 times. He even had a run with New Japan Pro Wrestling in 1987, which is a promotion that many wrestling fans today would recognize immediately. However, before that, in 1985, Mike had an accident that would forever change his life. During a tour in Israel, Mike suffered a shoulder injury, and on August 22nd, he underwent what seemed like a successful surgery. He was discharged from the hospital and rested at home for just 4 days before being readmitted to the hospital. His major symptom was a fever of 107 degrees Fahrenheit, or 42 degrees Celsius. He risked organ failure, lost 40 pounds, count them, 40 pounds, and came out of it with brain damage. Mike had suffered from what's known as toxic shock syndrome, which is a condition caused when a wound gets infected with a certain type of bacteria. This obviously was a pretty big deal. Mike just wasn't the same after everything. The weight loss and brain damage, of course, were the biggest problems of all. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself right now, wow, that's a lot of damage. I bet it can't get worse than that. Well, if that's what you're thinking, then you are wrong. In 1986, just a year after his fight with toxic shock syndrome, Mike was driving and lost control of his vehicle, causing it to overturn. He suffered even more head injuries on top of all the damage he already had. In my opinion, it's only by a miracle that David was able to make it back to the ring for his New Japan Pro Wrestling tour in 1987. He didn't wrestle many matches on that tour, or really at all after the incident for that matter, but as I said, family means everything, and he was a part of a pro wrestling family, so that's just what he did. Remember, Mike was supposed to fill the void left by David's death. That's already a hefty responsibility, but when you add in a number of health issues, both physical and mental, you've got a pretty bad situation on your hands. Mike became depressed and began to abuse drugs, which was a theme all too common for the Von Erichs. And on April 11th, 1987, he was arrested for DUI and marijuana possession, which was still pretty illegal in Texas at the time. A day after his bond was posted, Mike tragically made the decision to take his own life. He overdosed on alcohol and a tranquilizer called Placidil and was found the next morning. He left a note that began with, "Dad and Mom, I am in a better place. I'll be watching." He was 23 years old. Prior to Mike's death, there were 2 unique incidents in the family that I have to talk about. The first came 1 year before Mike's death. On June 4th, 1986, Kerry Von Erich was in a motorcycle accident that severely injured his right leg and dislocated his hip. According to his brother Kevin, Kerry was under the influence and tried jumping over a police car on his bike. However, the official story was that he was passing a truck and just simply crashed into a police car. He was supposed to rest after his successful surgeries, obviously, but instead opted to rush things and get back to wrestling as soon as he possibly could. Despite still feeling some immense pain, Kerry took some heavy painkillers, and on February 2nd, 1987, he wrestled a match against Brian Adias. The claim is that during that match, his leg was re-injured, which ultimately led to it being amputated. The struggles that followed Kerry for the rest of his life as a result of this amputation were immense. Of course, that didn't really stop Kerry, did it? He wrestled with a prosthetic leg for years afterward and kept it a secret from fans and most other wrestlers for as long as he possibly could. He even went as far as to shower with his boots on, all in the name of keeping his amputation a secret. Kevin Von Erich, who I know we haven't talked about much, had his own family accident to wrestle with before Mike's death. No pun intended.
I thought my jokes were bad.
Kevin had two daughters, Jill, who in 1987 was 2, and Kristen, who was 6. One day, Kevin was pulling into his garage while talking on the phone. The conversation clearly must have been pretty important, because once he pulled into the garage and lost signal, he backed out of the garage to regain signal and continue the conversation. What he didn't realize was that his two daughters had run outside to greet him, and he accidentally backed his car into 2-year-old Jill. She was put into intensive care for several weeks before being discharged and experienced massive weight loss. Fortunately, she lived through the ordeal and is thankfully still alive today. The reason I bring this up is because I want you to put yourself in Kevin's shoes for a second. Your brother with infinite potential, who's being built to become the next NWA World's Heavyweight Champion, dies suddenly. Then your other brother wins the NWA World title and loses it in 2.5 weeks. Later, he gets into an accident and has to have his foot amputated. And this is only after your other brother suffers a shoulder injury that ultimately gives him toxic shock syndrome and causes massive brain damage before getting into another head-injuring car accident. With all of this already weighing heavy on your soul, you hit your own daughter with your car by accident. And then, your brain-damaged brother decides to take his own life. Kevin describes this whole period of his life as a blur, and I can't blame him. If the situation I just described seems like a lot, it's because it was. It's hard for us to imagine the kind of trauma that Kevin must have gone through watching all of this happen around him. Yeah, this seems like a great opportunity to just pause the video for a second and just relax. Get a snack, get some water, tell your mom that you love her, do whatever you have to do. So let's do that. Let's pause the video in 3, 2, 1. The next few years were pretty rough for the Von Erich family. They weren't filled with more tragedies, just heartache from those of the past. Fritz, who had now seen 3 of his 6 children die tragically, decided to sell World Class Championship Wrestling, which would later become the Dallas promotion of the United States Wrestling Association, or USWA. The Von Erichs, namely Kevin and Kerry, continued to wrestle for the USWA until the Dallas promotion withdrew from the USWA to become World Class and closed shortly afterward. It was during the brothers' USWA run that their little brother Chris made his debut. This is where the movie The Iron Claw stops being helpful, because in the movie, Chris's character was completely removed from the story, the reasons for which we are going to talk about later. Chris Von Erich had played small roles in various angles over the years, but never became a full-fledged wrestler until 1990. See, Chris was very much unlike his brothers in at least one major way. Kevin, Kerry, and David were all natural athletes. They all stood at over 6 feet tall, all over 200 pounds, all very talented in the ring. Chris, who stood at 5'5", who weighed 175 pounds, and who was not as innately talented in the ring, still wanted to become a professional wrestler like his brothers. Chris also had several health issues that limited his time in the ring, including asthma and brittle bones. The asthma was probably manageable, but the brittle bones, which were caused by taking prednisone, was probably a big deal for someone whose profession was getting beat up night after night. To make matters worse, Chris also battled mental health issues, including depression and drug addiction, both of which started after Mike's death in 1987. So the rundown on Chris Von Erich is that he was shorter and smaller than most other wrestlers. He had a lung disease that required him to take prednisone, which caused him to have brittle bones and get injured very easily. He was addicted to drugs, including cocaine, and he had mental health issues. Obviously, I'm not trying to shame anyone for having these issues. It's just important to note that despite all of this, Chris still wanted to be a professional wrestler. The frustration that came from not making any headway into the family business, which his other brothers had little to no problem doing, weighed heavily on Chris's mind. I can't believe I'm saying this, but Chris, like his brother Mike, tragically decided to take his own life. On September 21st, 1991, Chris and his brother Kevin sat atop a hill and talked. A month earlier, Chris had broken his arm, and that night he was expressing some unfortunate thoughts because of his condition. Kevin pleaded with his brother not to hurt himself, and Chris assured him that nothing was going to happen. However, later that night, at 9 p.m., after Kevin had left, Chris was found with a self-inflicted 9mm gunshot wound to the head. He was rushed to the hospital with little life left in him, but tragically died when he got there, 20 minutes after he arrived. He was 21 years old. As I mentioned, in the Iron Claw, there is no Chris Von Erich. The reason he was cut from the story is literally because the narrative just could not handle one more death. All the deaths were becoming repetitive, especially after Mike's. So, for the sake of the narrative, the character based on the real-life Chris Von Erich, whose life could easily be a movie on its own, was cut from the screenplay. The Iron Claw's director, Sean Durkin, says that it was one of the toughest decisions he had to make, and that when you're trying to get a film made, you have to separate it at some point and say, these are characters on a page, and this is a film, and there's no way you're going to fully capture the life of a person in a film. You have to make difficult choices and try to get to something truthful or representative or emotional that reflects the core of the journey you're choosing to tell within this family. So, back in 1991, by the time of Chris's death, Kerry Von Erich, the former NWA World's Heavyweight Champion and amputee, had started working for Vince McMahon at the World Wrestling Federation, or WWF. One thing about Vince McMahon and the WWF, which is now the WWE, is that they like to have their wrestlers use company-specific names that they can't use anywhere else. For instance, Cody Rhodes, the current WWE champion, the son of Dusty Rhodes, cannot be Cody Rhodes outside of WWE. He has to just be Cody, because they owned that name Cody Rhodes first. So when Kerry Von Erich joined the WWF, he went under the name Texas Tornado. Texas Tornado was a fan favorite for a bit and had some high-profile rivalries with people like Ted DiBiase and Mr. Perfect, who he actually took the Intercontinental title from. Sadly, through all of this, Kerry was dealing with some of the same issues that a lot of wrestlers were facing at the time, such as steroid use and an addiction to painkillers, which followed from his amputation. But he also had to wrestle with his own personal demons, which were telling him that his brothers were calling out to him to join them in heaven. If that isn't disturbing enough, according to Bret the Hitman Hart, Kerry mentioned to him twice, once in 1990 and then again in 1992, that he had decided to join his brothers in heaven. Hart wrote in his autobiography, "Kerry and I talked on and on about our brothers and the good times we'd both had as famous families in such a strange business." Kerry can find that he'd made up his mind to join his brothers in heaven. He was only waiting for God to tell him when. I said, "Kerry, your children will always need you, even more than your brothers do. You have to think of your children." He allowed me to think I'd made him change his mind, but I feared it was only lip service. Kerry married Catherine Murray in 1983, and they had 2 daughters together, Holly in 1984 and Lacey in 1986. So, as Bret Hart was alluding to, he was more than just a wrestler, more than just a brother. He was a husband and a father, However, by early 1992, the family that he had built up was beginning to crumble. By April of 1992, he and his wife had divorced. Shortly after that, in August of the same year, Kerry was released by the WWF. Trust me, I know how quickly this is all going by. A minute ago, we were in early 1990. Texas Tornado was Intercontinental Champion, and things seemed to be going well. And now, we're in late 1992, and Kerry Von Erich is contemplating taking his own life. In late 1992 and early 1993, Kerry returned to Texas to make a few more appearances, at one point even winning the USWF Texas Heavyweight Championship for a pretty brief period. He even wrestled a match for Eastern Championship Wrestling, which would later be known as Extreme Championship Wrestling, or ECW. I thought that was a cool detail. Kerry Von Erich's final match was with the Global Wrestling Federation at the Dallas Sportatorium, where it all began. It was a tag team match where Kerry Von Erich and Chris Adams lost by disqualification to Johnny Mantell and Black Bart on February 12th, 1993. Kerry's drug addiction had caught up with him, and it led to some run-ins with the law. The first time he was arrested, he was charged with forging prescriptions, and fortunately, all he got was probation. However, after a second arrest, this time for cocaine possession, he was facing jail time. Because not only was he a repeat drug offender, but he was also breaking his probation. On February 18th, 1993, a day after being charged for the second time, Kerry Von Erich made the tragic decision to take his own life. Kerry desperately called his only living brother, Kevin, who was 200 miles away from the family ranch where Kerry was. Kevin called his father, who was also at the ranch, but according to Kevin, Fritz was too busy to talk because he was pouring concrete. Meanwhile, behind the ranch, Kerry took a single, self-inflicted gunshot to the heart with a .44 caliber pistol. According to Fritz, his last words were, "Dad, I love you," before hugging him and going behind the house to join his brothers in heaven. He was 33 years old.
Shocking news for wrestling fans this morning. Pro wrestler Kerry Von Erich has apparently taken his own life. He was one of the members of the famous Von Erich wrestling family. Kerry was found yesterday by his father near a farmhouse on the family ranch near Dallas.
No one should have to witness 5 out of their 6 children die, much less due to these freak accidents and unfortunate decisions. But that's exactly the horror that Jack Atkinson Sr. and Doris Smith experienced. First, it was Jack Jr., then David Von Erich, Mike Von Erich, Chris Von Erich, and finally, Kerry Von Erich. Now, only Kevin Von Erich remains. Fritz and his wife of 42 years, Doris, the mother of all 6 Atkinson kids, divorced in 1992. Fritz died some years after that in 1997 from brain and lung cancer. He was 68 years old. Doris later passed away in 2015 at the age of 82. Kevin stayed married to Pam and raised 4 kids with her: Kristen, Jill, David, and Kevin Jr. His career didn't last much longer after Kerry's death. One of the matches he had shortly after Kerry's passing was at the Global Wrestling Federation's Atkinson Benefit Show, where he teamed with Chris Adams to take down 2/3 of his old rivals, the Fabulous Freebirds, Michael Hayes and Buddy Roberts. His final run as a full-time wrestler was in 1995 with Jim Crockett Jr.'s NWA Dallas promotion, where he actually claimed the North American heavyweight title from Greg Valentine. Finally, after losing the title to a young wrestler named John Hawk, better known today as John Bradshaw Layfield, or JBL, he formally retired and stepped away from the wrestling scene. He made various appearances across the industry over the next 20 years, including a special 2005 episode of WWE Monday Night Raw that was in Dallas, Texas, where Kevin Von Erich actually got to put the Iron Claw on Rob Conway. Yeah, that segment makes me laugh. The next year, Kevin, who inherited the rights to all WCCW footage from his father, sold that footage to WWE, who then added it to the WWE Network archives, which is now available on Peacock. In 2009, Kevin Von Erich represented his entire family as they were all inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame at WrestleMania 25. They were inducted by Michael Hayes of the Fabulous Freebirds, the special guest referee who screwed Kerry Von Erich out of the NWA World Championship all those years ago. Today, Kevin lives in Hawaii with his wife Pam, and together they run an investment firm. He's gone on record saying he does not believe in the Von Erich curse, instead professing his belief and faith in God. To finish Kevin Von Erich's story, I want to read the last few paragraphs from an interview article that was done with Kevin by The Guardian. He's also busy with 13 grandchildren and several more foster grandchildren. A lot of people have hurt worse than me, he says. A man can be down and get kicked and kicked. You think to yourself, I quit, it's not fair. But I had this huge family that I love so much. I laugh every day. I look forward to waking up. And when he thinks about his brothers, he feels grateful for the time he had with them. When I look at all of that, I call it a good day. Everybody's gonna die. He repeats a question he's probably been asked many times over the years. Aren't you afraid you'll be next? Damn right I'll be next, he laughs. That doesn't bother me a bit. He commemorates his brothers every February. We have a boat in our pond. We put the Christmas tree on it, shove it out, and light it up. He remembers a time when he used to think life was too long, the years with everything he had to carry stretching out ahead of him. Now, I think life is too short. That's what I've learned. Just to love every minute. The thing about the Von Erich story is that it isn't exactly over yet. Yes, Kevin is living happily ever after, but what about the third generation? Fritz had 7 grandchildren, and 6 of them lived, so whatever happened to them? Well, Lacey Von Erich, the daughter of former WWF Intercontinental Champion and NWA World Champion Kerry Von Erich, made her professional wrestling debut in 2007. She wrestled on the independent circuit, which refers to independently owned regional promotions that operate outside of national promotions like WWE, AEW, TNA, etc. However, she eventually made her way to Total Nonstop Action, or TNA, where she actually became a TNA Knockouts Tag Team Champion with her tag team partner Velvet Sky. Unfortunately, she retired in 2010 after being diagnosed with meningitis, but thankfully has made a full recovery since then. Lacey's retirement from professional wrestling was not the end of the Von Erich legacy, though, as Kevin's sons, David and Kevin Jr., began their wrestling careers under the names Ross Von Erich and Marshall Von Erich. The two have been wrestling as the Von Erichs since 2012 and have made appearances all over the independent circuit. They've primarily been seen in Major League Wrestling, or MLW, where they earned the MLW World Tag Team Championships. They also performed at a special one-night-only pay-per-view event called Ric Flair's Last Match, which is exactly what it sounds like. There, they were defeated by Mark and Jay, them boys, the Briscoe brothers. Most interesting to me is that on July 9th, 2017, Ross and Marshall actually teamed up with their father, Kevin Von Erich, at the Rage Mega Show in Tel Aviv, Israel, for his first match in 22 years and his last match ever. In the match, the three of them faced Jumping Lee, Jerry Royf, and Marty Jannetty. Some of those older fans were probably in tears as they watched all three Von Erichs apply the Iron Claw to their opponents to win the match. But like I said, this story isn't over yet. Today, Ross and Marshall Von Erich are 2/3 of the Ring of Honor 6-man tag team champions with none other than Dustin Rhodes. They won the belt at All Elite Wrestling's Battle of the Belt 11, which was only about a month ago. I thought that was just the coolest thing ever, seeing them win the championships with Dustin Rhodes like that. What's even cooler is that they won the belts in Arlington, Texas, which is just outside of Dallas, where the original Von Erichs found their glory. It really comes full circle, doesn't it? I'm not going to pretend like the Von Erich story is a happy one necessarily, or even an easy one to read about, write about, or even hear about. Throughout my research, I kept on wondering if this is even a story that people want to hear about, because it's just so tragic and depressing. But then I got to the end. You, if you're still watching this, got to the end. So did you notice anything? Kevin is living happily with his wife of over 40 years on an island in Hawaii. He owns his own business and keeps himself busy with 13 grandchildren. He says he's happy to wake up in the morning, that he laughs every day, and that he loves every moment that he has. How could a man who's been through so much trauma be so happy in the end? That right there is why I wanted to tell this story. Everyone who's going through different trials and tribulations in their lives needs to find the reason to keep going. Something motivates all of us to get up in the morning and work as hard as we do. And I personally believe that we need to lock that down and hold on to it as tightly as we can, just like Kevin did after watching 4 of his closest family members and friends die before him. Kevin explained it pretty well in his interview with The Guardian. He said that it was his family that kept him motivated and that he believes in a God who loves us and has our best interest in mind. So while, yes, the tragedies of the Von Erich family may make for a sad story, the triumph of Kevin Von Erich and his family, at least to me, is satisfying, motivating, and tells a beautiful story of family and goodness prevailing through destruction and evil. And if not for nothing, it allows me to talk about pro wrestling for a while. I think that's why Sean Durkin decided to make a movie about the Von Erich story. The Iron Claw is not only an accurate representation of the professional wrestling world, especially in the 1970s and 80s, but it shows the shimmer of hope that kept a man going when he just kept getting kicked and kicked down by evil. So good for you, Sean Durkin. Anyway, before we close, I wanted to look back at the timeline of events, because I know it got a bit hazy, going back and forth between family members and their stories. So here we go. In 1953, Fritz Von Erich debuts. In 1959, Jack Atkinson Jr., Fritz's first son, drowns after being electrocuted. 1969. By now, Fritz owns WCCW and the Dallas Sportatorium. 1976. Kevin Von Erich debuts. 1977. David Von Erich debuts. 1978. Kerry Von Erich debuts. David Von Erich marries Candy McLeod. They divorce the next year. David and Candy have a daughter, Natasha, who dies in infancy. 1980. Kevin Von Erich marries Pamela May. 1981. Kerry Von Erich begins a feud with the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion, Nature Boy Ric Flair, and Kevin's daughter Kristen is born. 1982. David Von Erich marries Patricia Matter. Kerry Von Erich faces Ric Flair for the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship in a steel cage match and loses after an interference by the Fabulous Freebirds, starting an iconic years-long rivalry between the Von Erichs and the Freebirds. 1983, Mike Von Erich debuts. David Von Erich begins a feud with the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion, Nature Boy Ric Flair, who is being groomed to be the next NWA World Champion. And Kerry Von Erich marries Catherine Murray. 1984. On February 10th, David Von Erich dies of ruptured intestines resulting from acute enteritis. May 6th, Kerry Von Erich wins the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship at the David Von Erich Memorial Parade of Champions at the Texas Stadium in front of 45,000 people. He loses it 18 days later in a controversial match. And finally, Kerry's daughter Holly is born. 1985, on August 22nd, Mike Von Erich has shoulder surgery, and just 4 days later, he is readmitted to the hospital and diagnosed with toxic shock syndrome, causing permanent brain damage. And finally, Kevin's daughter Jill is born. 1986 rolls around and Mike Von Erich gets into a car accident. On June 4th, Kerry Von Erich gets into a motorcycle accident and suffers brutal injuries. And Kerry's daughter Lacey is born. In 1987, Mike Von Erich miraculously makes it back to the ring for a New Japan Pro Wrestling tour. On February 2nd, Kerry Von Erich re-injures his leg in a match with Brian Adias, causing it to be amputated. On April 11th, Mike Von Erich is arrested for DUI and drug possession. And on April 12th, Mike decides to take his own life. Kevin accidentally backs his car into his 2-year-old daughter, Jill, and Chris Von Erich becomes depressed over his brother's suicide and turns to drugs to cope. In 1988, on June 1st, Kevin's son, Ross Von Erich, is born. In 1989, Fritz Von Erich sells WCCW as it merges with the CWA to become the USWA. In 1990, Chris Von Erich debuts. In June, Kerry Von Erich signs with the WWF under the name Texas Tornado. Kerry Von Erich mentions to Bret Hart that he wants to join his brothers in heaven for the first time. On September 21st, 1991, Chris Von Erich decides to take his own life. In 1992, Kerry Von Erich mentions to Bret Hart that he wants to join his brothers in heaven for the second time. In April, Kerry Von Erich and his wife Catherine become divorced. And in August, Texas Tornado Kerry Von Erich is released by the WWF. November 11th, Kevin's son Marshall Von Erich is born. 1993, Kerry Von Erich returns to Texas to make various appearances across the Dallas territories. February 12th, Kerry Von Erich has his final match at the Dallas Sportatorium. On February 17th, Kerry Von Erich is indicted for drug possession. And the next day, on February 18th, Kerry Von Erich decides to take his own life. In 1995, Kevin Von Erich formally retires from pro wrestling at age 38. In 1997, on September 10th, Fritz Von Erich passes away. On October 3rd, 2005, Kevin Von Erich appears on Raw Homecoming and ports the Iron Claw on Rob Conway. In October of 2006, Kevin Von Erich sells the WCCW footage to WWE. In 2007, Lacey Von Erich debuts, and Kevin Von Erich and his family move to Hawaii, where he lives to this day. In 2010, Lacey Von Erich retires early. In 2012, Ross and Marshall Von Erich debut as a tag team. In 2015, Doris Smith-Atkinson passes away. In 2017, on July 9th, Kevin and his sons, Ross and Marshall Von Erich, team up at the Rage Mega Show in Tel Aviv for Kevin's final match ever. In 2019, Ross and Marshall Von Erich sign a multi-year contract with Major League Wrestling. And on February 11th, Ross and Marshall Von Erich win the MLW World Tag Team Championships. And finally, on July 27th, 2024, Ross and Marshall Von Erich and Dustin Rhodes win the Ring of Honor 6-Man Tag Team Championships. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you stuck around for this long, then you probably enjoyed the video. So if you did enjoy and you want to see more videos, then hit subscribe and we'll see the next time I get the time to upload. That's the thing about content creation. You really gotta have the time to do it. And recently, I just haven't had the time. In March, I started ring announcing for local pro wrestling here in Florida, and I absolutely love it. Most weekends, I have something to do, either announcing a small gig or just helping out at a bigger promotion.
The following contest is a tag team match set for one fall, and it is for the Florida Tag Team Championships.
I could go on about ring announcing forever, but I'm gonna not. So that's me. I might make a video on my ring announcing eventually, but for now, I'm out. Thanks again so much for watching. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and remember, God loves you. Bye.